Yeah. So how much do we actually raise? Well,
good afternoon, everyone. And of course, good morning to our American friends on the call. My name is Mark Hughes, and I'm the Director of Membership Services at Charities Institute Ireland. At Charities Institute Ireland, we work hard to provide education, networking, and advocacy on behalf of our membership. I was so happy to see that over 200 people registered to attend this session, including many of our members and colleagues from around Europe. I thank you all for your time, and I hope that you will enjoy the next 60 minutes. This afternoon's session is titled Investing in the Future. The purpose of today's session is to help charities tap into one of the most lucrative forms of fundraising, and I'm thrilled to be joined by John Sutton. John is Director of Persuasion Republic, Ireland's leading fundraising and social marketing agency. John has worked on developing legacy campaigns for some of Ireland's biggest charities. I'm also excited to hear from John Bacon, our keynote speaker today. John is Chief Development Officer for Planned Giving at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York City. We've a really diverse mix of charities in attendance today, including many arts organisations from the RAISE programme in Ireland. And I've no doubt that we'll all take away lots of learnings from what will be discussed over the next hour. Finally, Charities Institute Ireland are thrilled to bring you this webinar in partnership with the King Benoit Foundation US. Before I finish, I'd like to say a huge thank you to Elena, Deputy Director at KBFUS, and Emily and Lindsay from Global Philanthropy for working behind the scenes and bringing us this session. So over to you, Elena.
Thank you so much, Mark. I'm Elena Fortunato, so as Mark said, the Deputy Director of the King Benoit Foundation United States. Thank you so much for taking the time today, everybody. There's some familiar names on the attendee list, but for those who aren't familiar with us, please just allow me a brief word. We facilitate thoughtful, effective giving to Europe and Africa. The King Benoit Foundation United States enables U.S. donors to support their favorite causes overseas. We provide European and African nonprofits with cost-effective solutions to raise funds in the U.S. through a tool we call an American Friends Fund. We have over 500 American Friends Funds, including with institutions like the Rijksmuseum, Institut Curie, Mama Cash, and the National Library of France, among others. These funds save nonprofits the trouble and expense of setting up their own 501c3 public charity. KBFUS handles all back office administration, including tax receipts and donor support. If you have donors or supporters in the US and you need some assistance facilitating those gifts, please do reach out to us. Also, through our family of foundations, we have partnerships that can allow you to receive donations in Canada, throughout Europe, Asia, and Australia. So don't hesitate to reach out to me if you're interested in that. My information will be available after the program today. In addition to these services, we do have education opportunities like this one, and usually an in-person study visit that we have every spring, where we talk about the American model of fundraising and welcome folks to our offices in New York to hear from distinguished speakers like John Bacon and many others. The circumstances are strange, obviously, this year and last, but I do hope that we can continue that program sometime soon. So if you're interested in joining us in New York, please do reach out to me. I would love to include you in that invitation. Now, without further ado, just some quick points, and I'm going to introduce the speakers. All the participants, you're in listen-only mode. The session is being recorded, and if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A function, which you'll see at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So please do put those in there. So let me introduce the first speaker, Mr. John Sutton. John is the founding member of Persuasion Republic and one of the leading fundraising experts in Ireland. He's worked with most of the country's leading nonprofit groups for over 20 years, including major fundraising campaigns, appeals, and strategies. He's the founding board member of Fighting Words and on the board for 10 years until 2018, leading a fundraising committee to raise more than €1 million from 2016 to 2018. And he's currently on the board of Persuasion Republic, North Bay Educate Together School, Art to Heart, and Report. John?
Hi, thanks very much, Elena. When Mark at CII asked me to say a few words about the Irish context for legacy fundraising as part of today's webinar, my first thought was, of course, is that we should and must do better. The latest estimates of legacy fundraising in Ireland run something like this. The UK raises 3.4 billion, and we are 1/14 of the population of the UK. So if pro rata it applied here, we would raise somewhere in the order of 280 million euros. That's something to benchmark ourselves against. But how much do we actually raise? Well, today we know for sure that we raise 55 million. And we know that because Campaign Solutions have recently published a legacy tracker research report in 2021 that has identified that sum from over 90, I think it's 95 charities. I was speaking to Niall at Campaign Solutions yesterday in advance of today and me saying a few words, and we were chatting about the known unknown, which is the church. And we were trying to estimate roughly between us in conversation how much we reckon the Irish Catholic Church or churches were in receipt these days of legacies. And we came up with a ballpark figure of between 10 and 15 million. So a best case scenario in terms of Irish legacy fundraising today would be somewhere in the order of 70 million. So that's approximately 1/4 of the UK pro rata figure of 280. In the UK, we also know that legacy income amounts to 14% of all fundraised income. But here it looks like it's closer to 5%. And that's assuming that our fundraised income is 1.3 billion. Some think it's higher. So if that was the case, 1.5 or 1.6 billion, then that 5% could be even smaller again. And of course, comparing ourselves to the UK is comparing ourselves to one of the best in class. So we should possibly look elsewhere for other comparisons. And again, Niall's tracker report talks about New Zealand, and we also in conversation talked about Belgium. And this data that he has suggests that we're raising roughly 50% of what they're raising there. So regardless of where we look, the consensus seems to be that we can and should be raising more, anything from 100 to 300% more. One interesting fact to note is that of that 70 million, that in a good year, Vincent de Paul, Concern and Trócaire can receive 15 million of that, or over 20%. That's 3 charities out of 11,000 in Ireland, raising 20% of the income. So why we are behind, and some would say that we're way behind, we want to ask, are there any positives? And I think that there are a few. We are raising more legacy income than ever before. Again, the Campaign Solutions Tracker says that in the 5 years from 2015 to 2019, it rose from 30 to 50 million plus. It actually went up to 70 million the year Elizabeth O'Kelly made her wonderful gift of 30 million in 2017. More charities are now securing legacies. Again, in the same tracker, it's up from 83 in 2015 to 95 in 2019. We also know that My Legacy, the consortium of charities working on legacy promotion, has more members than ever before, is more active and better supported. The first legacy managers are now in place. Granted, it's a small number, but they are there. And I think there's significantly more interest in the area and the issue of legacy fundraising. Just look at today's attendance. Mark already referenced it. It's over 200, 220 people. Yesterday, I was talking to Damien O'Brien from Ask Direct, and he reminded me that back in 2003, we organised the first Legacy Tracker report launch, and we had the grand total of 12 people in the Temple Bar Hotel, with a presentation from the then CEO of Remember, a charity in the UK, which was a star legacy attraction, or so we thought. Also today in Ireland, there are Irish fundraising agencies with legacy service offerings. You've Mary O'Kennedy, you've Ask Direct, you've Campaign Solutions and ourselves. This is all in the last 10 years. We've also seen the publication of other research other than the Campaign Solutions one this year. As Direct published Legacy Communications report in 2019. Community Foundation Ireland produced their Legacies for Good report in 2018. NFP Synergy published research on wills and legacies in 2018. And then Persuasion Republic had its own legacy snapshot in 2018. 2 and 3 are also now publishing, as part of their annual fundraising reports, information on legacy fundraising. And all of these reports that I'm mentioning are available to us, to you these days. Looking ahead, what are the opportunities and challenges? We know that there are a few major macro trends working in favor of legacy fundraising in Ireland. We have the fastest growing economy in the Western world. We're a complete outlier and have been for a decade. Our property prices are rising. Our population is aging. The number of deaths is set to rise. Family size is reducing. The number of childless families is increasing. And Irish households are now wealthier than ever before. And the wealth transfer at death is bigger than ever before. The CFI report that I mentioned from 2018 estimated then that at least 6 billion was currently being transferred. We also know that COVID is positively impacting. People are motivated to help more than ever. I was speaking to Grace from Trócaire, and she was telling me yesterday how her job has changed a lot since COVID and how personal connections to her legacy pledgers is so much stronger now. People seem to be willing to and want to talk about how they can help. We also know that the number of wills being made has increased. The number of visits to legacy websites and pages has increased significantly. So it might seem inevitable that legacy income in Ireland will increase. But will it? Is it possible that we will still be here in 5 years' time, a little bit better off, but still significantly behind the curve? And the short answer to this is yes. There are warning signs. Property prices don't look like collapsing anytime soon, but they might. The post-COVID economy may go into recession. We think it won't, but it may. Faith-based giving has fueled legacy giving in Ireland for the past decades, and this is changing. It's declining, but how it will change, we don't know for sure. NFP research that I mentioned in 2018 says that the percentage of people saying they will leave a gift in their will to an Irish charity is declining. It declined from 19 to 14% over the past 8 to 10 years. And then the rise in planned giving while living is on the up. Just look at the Kinsellas and their 30 million gift to Trinity last month. But in talking to some colleagues over the past few days, the most significant factor that is limiting the growth or will limit the growth in legacy fundraising in Ireland is still the lack of investment and specialist knowledge. As charities and NGOs, our level of investment in legacy marketing and promotion is tiny, not small, tiny. Legacy programs require medium to long-term investment, and the vast majority of Irish charity boards won't do that. There is a dominant culture of immediate ROI when it comes to fundraising. Finance departments can be a problem in charities. The belief that legacy income will come in anyway, you can't influence it, you can't grow it, spending money on it is a waste. On a lot of boards and SMTs, the notion that legacy donors arrive out of nowhere and they are not known to the organization or not connected in any way is alive and well. And skills and knowledge. We simply need more skills, more expertise, and more knowledge. We know by comparison to our UK peers that there's a huge deficit here. So my question is there a leap that Irish legacy fundraising can take in the next 5 years that will change all this? I hope so. And that's why so many of us turn up at events like this. We have a hunger to learn, hearing stories of how others are achieving success and interrogating that for what we can use is one route to new success for ourselves. So no pressure, John. Over to you now. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John Sutton. And, thank you so much for setting the context for Ireland, which I think is also very familiar for a lot of the friends on the call that are from other European countries as well. So thank you so much for laying that groundwork. And please allow me to introduce our esteemed speaker, Mr. John Backend. John is the Chief Development Officer for Planned Giving at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York since 2017. Prior to that, John was the director of planned giving at the New York Public Library for 14 years. And earlier in his career, he served as the first vice president for philanthropic services at the financial firm Smith Barney, now Morgan Stanley, and associate for trust and estate at Ballard Spahr. So thank you so much, John, for joining us, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, everyone. Welcome from New York and from the museum. And I will attempt to share my screen while we're doing this. Oops, and I should have been a little better prepared because I'm in the wrong program. Apologies. Let me get to PowerPoint. Here we go, and I apologize again for the little hiccup there. I thank John Sutton very much for the context, and to give you a sense, the figures he mentioned for Ireland are not dissimilar to the figures that the Metropolitan Museum actually achieves in a given year, with some ups and downs. It depends on big mega gifts. But I was going to talk to you about best practices and tips from an American perspective, and some of what I'm going to talk about is specific to the American tax context, and also from the perspective of a mature institution, actually two, both the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I work currently, and the New York Public Library, where I worked previously. Both are mature institutions and rely very heavily on the American model of private philanthropy. So for instance, even though the New York Public Library sounds like it's government funded, a significant percentage of the budget is raised privately every year, and it is controlled by a private board. So the American context is somewhat different, a longer history of so-called planned giving or legacy planning or giving, as you call it, often with a deferral component in it, but not always. So here I say, what is a planned gift? Which is an important question to ask. Generally speaking, a planned gift is one that is made in the context of the donor's overall financial and estate plan, and often, but not always, defers payment to charity for a period of years or until the donor dies. Usually death is the measuring factor. So these often take time, which is an issue, as John correctly pointed out, and can be compared easily to outright or annual giving and campaign pledges, which are very common as well in the American context. We have the same issues with investment in planned giving being kind of a long-term prospect that some finance people and trustees do not understand, but the results pay off beautifully, and a mature program can be a reliable source of income for the institution, which is why the places I've worked have established programs. Typical forms of planned gifts include, list them here, a bequest under a will or living, i.e. revocable trust. That is by far the most important form because it's the easiest and the most lucrative, if you will, from the charity's perspective. Beneficiary designation of accounts or insurance policies are also a very important component. Life income gifts, and these come in several flavors, largely tax motivated or tax advantages, a charitable gift annuity, pooled income fund, and charitable remainder trust. All of those came into their current existence due to a tax act in 1969 here in the US. But forms of them have existed over time prior. And there are other irrevocable trusts, including lead trusts, life insurance trust, and any number of other tax-motivated arrangements. I will not really cover those because those do not come to the charity usually. They come from the donor and the donor's advisor. Usually the donor's been sold on something and the charity is simply named to give it a favorable tax treatment. But the important thing to focus on are bequests. Why do people do planned gifts? Donor intent is critical. And really the reason people are doing these is because the donor believes in and wants to support your mission. That's obvious, but sometimes one forgets this when we're talking about planned giving. And we can very easily get bogged down in technical details, but it's all about the mission and about a relationship with the donor, both with you as a fundraising officer, with your leadership, and with the organization itself, with the programs, etc. So a lifelong relationship that hopefully will bear fruit down the road. So even large public charities like NYPL that receive significant governmental support, as I said earlier, rely on private funding, and planned gifts are one of the best long-term sources for this funding and a critical supplement to annual and other outright gifts. At the library and at the Met, planned giving is roughly a quarter to a third of the annual funds raised, albeit that I'm a two-person team here in a 50-person development office. Many planned gifts are tax motivated, as I said, notably life income gifts and charitable trusts, and involve working with a donor's legal and tax advisors. But I note here, watch out for situations that are purely transactional. There are people who want to do gifts that benefit them and ultimately benefit your organization. But if they are not truly charitable gifts, that is something of a sham and might even unwind to your detriment and to their detriment. So watch out for people who approach you, especially with fancy insurance-related gifts and so on. They may be purely transactional and not truly charitable. A snapshot of the New York Public Libraries program. The origin of the library itself in the late 19th century, it just turned 125 years old last year, was due to planned gifts. The Astor, Lenox, and Tilden gifts founded the library in the 1890s. Many other bequests in the first 90 years of the library's existence, but there only was a dedicated planned giving program starting in the 1980s. Not uncommon. I mentioned the 1969 Act in the US that kind of created some of these so-called split interest gifts. That was a big impetus. And many people started to get into this very seriously in the 1980s, including the library. Since that time, the planned giving program at the library has been consistently staffed with 2 to 4 professionals with defined responsibilities. Usually one person was in charge of the overall direction of the program. One person did the estate administration on the back end, if you will, and another person did other things, stewardship, etc. They currently have 3 professionals on staff. The library launched a pool income fund in 1990 and started issuing charitable gift annuities in 1993. The Met program is not dissimilar, and the growth of the museum, which we turned 150 years old last year, was due to planned gifts both of art, which I list some names up there, and money, more importantly. And the Rogers and Fletcher gifts in the early 20th century are still huge endowments, in both cases for purchase of art, but very, very important to the growth of the museum. Many other bequests again in the first 100 years, but again, the dedicated planned giving program only started here in the late 1970s. And that was only because one of the general counsel office members took a strong interest in this and actually was a leader in the New York community in this area. We have been consistently staffed since that time with 1 to 3 professionals with defined responsibilities. And I am currently the head of a team of 2. So we're relatively lean, but do quite well. The Met also has a life income gift program that started in the early 1990s. So I guess the point is, to John's comment, sustained investment in this area is maybe a stretch for a lot of organizations to have dedicated staff, but having a dedicated program, or at least part-time dedicated staff, is very valuable and a worthwhile investment. It will pay off over time if you stick to your guns and have a consistent messaging and approach to this area. Bequests are king, I say here. Life income gifts are useful arrows in our quiver, but in terms of dollars and E's, bequests, including beneficiary designations and payable on death accounts, should be the focus of any planned giving program, especially at a small charity with no dedicated planned giving or even development staff, although I understand most of you are probably development staff members. There is no reason your charity cannot, from time to time, simply advertise that you're willing and able and happy to accept bequests, and they will come. They may come even if you don't advertise, but it cannot hurt to encourage people to consider you as part of their plans. Trust and life income gifts bring several forms of liability, at least some of which the charitable beneficiary and fiduciary may bear the brunt of. We at the Met and at the library, New York Public Library, did not serve as trustee of independent trusts set up by outside people. There is just too much responsibility and arguably also a conflict of interest. If we're the remainder beneficiary, we want certain things that the income beneficiary may not want, and so on. Basically avoid getting in those situations where you're taking on a fiduciary role unless you have a very willing and able finance office, which is probably not the case here, believe you me, but that can be very sophisticated and lots of liability. And I mentioned the issues there in the third bullet, investment performance, longevity, and potential conflicts of interest really are a big problem. So I would avoid that at all costs because ultimately it could be a financial problem. Reputational damage is probably the ultimate big problem. When things go bad, it's not good to be in the paper. So keep it simple. Bequests are easy to advertise, if you will, and really require very little work on the back end. Prospecting, this is really what the focus of our work is on, and what I hope you can take away from this conversation. If your organization has a well-managed donor database of at least several thousand names, you may have a reasonable plan giving pool. If you don't have that, don't worry. These basic ideas will be applicable to your group, even if you have only several thousand non-qualified names, say. A mix of direct mail and e-communications or a combination of the same can be effective. And we do a lot of direct mail. We follow up with an e-communication at an interval or 2 intervals after that, and that seems to work quite well. And of course, the benefit of the e-communications is that they are effectively free, depending on how you produce them. Plan giving appeals are different from annual fund and other appeals, but best not to have them fall on top of other communications. So I am fishing in the pool of our membership department, which has several 100,000 active members at any given time and is mailing that many pieces of mail at any given time. And we try not to fall right on top of their renewal appeals or their acquisition appeals, but kind of go in between those with our plan giving appeals, which are quite different. They're asking for a lifetime gift and a very different kind of a thing, not for an outright gift in most cases. If you're just starting, a testimonial from a founder or well-regarded volunteer leader is a great place to start. And I have done that at every place I've ever been, and on smaller charities on which I serve on the board, we've done testimonials as a way to get things started, and that works very well. People tend to give to people, and if you have someone that embodies your mission or has created the organization, they may be a logical person to start this kind of a legacy program. If your database is large enough, segment to target those most likely to be interested. This should be an ongoing process, and you can evaluate the results to see what works and doesn't work. I've been blessed to have data managers at both places I've worked on the charitable side who do very helpful analyses and can segment things beautifully. You can do a very crude one based on some very simple factors, and I list the most important ones in the second bullet there. Age is an obvious one. The less deferral, the better. Although we try and acquire plan giving donors really starting at roughly my age, in their 50s on up. Years of consistent giving is probably the most important of all. That is a bellwether of whether someone's truly engaged with your organization and is kind of keeping the faith. And recent giving, that can work both ways. We often see that our plan giving donors trail off towards the end of their life. They have medical or other pressing concerns. Some other ones start giving things away towards the end of life. but that's often a factor you can weigh in depending on your organization and how it looks. Secondary factors, and really the first one is extremely important, are family status and gender. Single, older women are your key demographic. I assume that's the same in Ireland and continental Europe, UK as well. They are the most generous, and very often if they're a widow of someone and no children, that is really very, very important. Or if they've always been unmarried, they are your people. And the size of gifts as a secondary factor. If someone has made consistent gifts, I'll say $100 a year here in the US is a pretty common figure, and then they make two or three $5,000 gifts. That's a pretty good indication that they have some capacity, they have some flexibility, they have money, and they're the type that will start to can and do make 6- and 7-figure bequests to your organization if you keep them engaged. Current planned giving donors are among your best prospects and potential ambassadors for your program. Every week I get someone asking for a new life income gift who has one already, or saying that a friend is interested based on them talking about what they do for the museum. So your current donors really can be great tools, and many will do repeat gifts, especially life income gifts. And at the bottom, I note that there are direct mail and newsletter vendors, a few of which I list here in the US, but they're not cheap, of course. They're in business. They're doing this to earn their living. And I find them a bit generic. I think if you had any ability to produce something in-house, and maybe with an outside designer, if you want to make it look better, I think that's strikes a more genuine note and is more meaningful to your most dedicated supporters. I get newsletters from different charities I support or my family supports from the people listed here, and they're all basically the same with a very light branding or gloss by the charity sending it out. And I'm not sure that does anyone any good favors. They also tend to be a little too technical. Again, it's the mission people are giving to. They're not that concerned with saving taxes in the end. Some are, and if they can save money and make a tax-effective gift, wonderful, but they're giving to your mission. At the library, for many years, we sent out a print testimonial, just kind of a blunderbuss. We sent out 30,000 letters, often with a simple A-B split to segment them. But that was a little bit of a broad approach, not inexpensive to send that amount of mail. So more recently, towards the end of my time at the library, we did a lot of careful segmentation, and I created a willingness algorithm to help with that, and some other factors, some of which we already discussed. But the algorithm simply weighted years of giving, amount of giving overall, age if we had it, and if we knew family status, that was weighted as well. And that helped us to really winnow down the pool out of the really several hundred thousand donors who I could have been sending mail to, and very helpful. And now, as I said, we do follow up the print with email containing the same information. Very often we repeat it verbatim, but somehow when you see something in a print form and then you see it as an email, it feels like a different appeal. But it's just simply reinforcing it, and the email is, as I said, really pretty easy to do. The only big problem for us here stateside, and I assume for many of you, is we don't have valid email addresses for all of our supporters. And some of the best ones are of a generation where email is not necessarily their preferred mode of communication. So I think doing both print and e-communications is important. And if you're only doing e-communications, know that you may be missing some folks along the way. Right before I left, we did a brochure at the library, which was useful. It's often good to have some collateral to give to people when you meet in person. And we mailed those out, and it was a modest expenditure, $14,000 as I show you here, but probably worthwhile. I think that was a good effort and nice to have something to actually hand out. The results. Our older testimonials regularly yielded up to 100 qualified responses and between 20 and 40 new commitments. Given that the average realized commitment was something in the order of $70,000, that was a pretty good return. So it's worth investing both in the staff and in the direct market costs to yield new commitments. Smaller targeted mailings in recent years yielded pretty similar results proportionally, but with slightly more new commitments. So we did a lot better at a significantly lower cost because we were mailing a lot less. And as I said, the brochure has been helpful at the library. I don't know how they're using it currently since I'm not there anymore. But again, at the bottom here, be willing to try new things and evaluate them. Always, if you're doing something new or slightly different, look at the results, tweak it for the next time, consider mixing channels, and of course, update materials as tax and other laws change. But again, never lose sight of your mission. You're selling the mission. At the Met, the Planned Giving gets a centerfold in a biannual, it's actually now 4 times a year, donor newsletter, which is circulated to 5,000 higher level donors. That's fabulous because I can focus on a current gift or a recent estate gift, but it's a relatively small number of people, although they're the most high capacity people who are giving. Larger targeted mailings are also sent out, up to 35,000 in a given year. And we insert a buck slip in annual appeals used to advertise estate and gift planning seminars. And more recently, our 150 to 150, which I mentioned at the bottom. Our life income mailings we do from time to time are not wildly successful, but we get a steady flow of inquiries and of people self-identifying new expectancies. A lot of our traffic is driven by just people who've come to the museum either as their whole life or in recent years, very often from outside of New York, and they come to us, which is lovely. I don't have to find them. And many of them are not even in our mailing list, so they self-identify in that way. Usually through the website, I should add. That's a very common place that people will get initial information, and then we'll try and start a dialogue. This last fiscal year, this year and last, excuse me, we mounted a bequest challenge to get 150 new expectancies in honor of the Met's 150th. We had very mixed results because we started this process in February of 2020, and we all know what happened the month thereafter, but we have more than 100, and we decided to continue it for one more year with a kind of a COVID grace period to try and get up to that 150 by June 30th of next year. And I'm pretty confident we will. Just to give you an idea, in a given year, we get between 30 and 40 new commitments on average without a big press. So this was a pretty significant stretch goal for us, and I think one that we'll achieve, but with an extra year time to do so. Other ways to prospect the websites, I list them here. The libraries is fine. The Mets is better. In both cases, I'm not so sure about the library anymore, but the Mets is designed internally. We don't use a vendor for it. It's really about driving inquiries. The key is to start a dialogue with the prospect or their advisor and to start to build a relationship. And I think you should try and make them call or email you and put a face to your name. And again, people give to people. They really, I think, want to talk to someone about this. It's very important to them. It's a life event of a sort for them to make a legacy gift. So I think it's very important to make it as personal as possible. And that way you can also make sure that you're stewarding them correctly or cultivating them correctly, steering them towards unrestricted giving, which is very important in most institutions, and answering any questions they have now or in the future. There are, third bullet here, web-based prospecting tools. One that's become very important here is called MarketSmart. That may be a solution, especially if you have no or small staff, but of course they have a cost and they rely on the data. If you don't have good data about your donors, they're not going to be able to help you too well. Similarly, vendor-generated Planned Giving websites can be effective and they're usually very attractive. But often I find that they can be a little overdone and again, too technical and slightly generic. I think creating a website in this area that's simple and that says what people can do and makes them call you or contact you is the best way to go. And estate and gift seminars. I used to present 10 or so of these annually while at the library, and an outside expert does one annually here at the Met. But basically they're educational programs, but you can also invite prospects and do an evaluation form that will qualify leads for you. At the library, it was effective enough that I kept doing them, but I believe that they've stopped doing them almost entirely since I left. And at the Met, it's more of a formal evening affair and really more about just getting people into the museum and thinking about this, not so much getting people to expect gifts. Stewardship, keep them happy. Legacy societies are very important, and in the US, kind of a big deal. The library had a very well-established one called the Bigelow Society, and they can really keep plan giving donors near and dear to your charity. If you steward them effectively, they will stay true to you, and you will benefit in the end. The Bigelow Society had about 1,000 members, and the comparable Met Williams Society has about almost as many now, but more than 900 members. And in this case, members means households, really. So it's a lot of couples, but a lot of single people. And as I said, unmarried people are extremely important because very often they will not have natural heirs, and unmarried females are the best possible prospects. The library offered members up to 10 special events annually, including a formal tea each spring, which attracted up to 300 guests. We did it on the library premises, but the catering alone cost $30,000. So think hard about whether you need to have such a lavish event. Donors loved it. Remember all these single older ladies, they absolutely loved it, but it was not without cost and some hassle. The Met offers fewer but fancier events. Most of ours are curator-driven evening events where we all give people wine and whatnot. But I also am adding some to fill out the schedule. For instance, I give tours of the museum now in areas where there are not curators or cross-curatorial bounds. But those have proved to be very popular and I enjoy doing them. So it's all good. And again, it's about connecting with the donors. We're not doing these just to do them. We're doing them to develop these relationships. Speaking of which, I send birthday and holiday cards, several hundred a year, to a subset, but everyone, so all 1,000 members plus or minus, receive a personalized signed biannual letter that lists the upcoming Legacy Society events, as well as general donor communications. Those with email are getting communications from our director here at the museum on a regular basis and other things. And there are lots of virtual programming offerings that our donors get, even if they're not technically members of the museum, regular annual members. And of course, members are listed in the annual report unless they prefer not to be. This used to be a big deal when we had printed annual reports, but by the time I left the library, that was not the case. And the Met too has gone virtual in this regard, but there are some people who really want to see their name on that list of the Legacy Society members. And it's easy enough to do that and something you should keep in mind if you create a Legacy Society. The back end, do not neglect. Estate administration, know the basics of the probate process in the jurisdiction where the majority of your donors reside, or get outside help with the same, pro bono and or paid. I happen to be a trust and estates attorney, so have a personal interest in this. 95% of it is fairly straightforward. We just sign things and get money, but the extra 5%, it helps to have a little bit of information. We have a very robust internal counsel here at the museum and the library too, for that matter. But very often they themselves would reach out to lawyers on retainer with very sticky questions, especially disputed estates. Timeliness and periodic review of open matters, open estates that means, are critical to getting the dollars in. Some estates will take years and tears, I say, before full distribution is made. And in New York, and I assume also in Ireland and the other jurisdictions we're talking to today, there is a public body, in our case it's the Charities Bureau, that can be an advocate in difficult situations. And I assume that there are similar watchdogs, as I just said. We try not to bring them in unless we absolutely have to. They like when we do a lot of self-help. And since we do have dedicated plan giving staff, we do most of this ourselves. And they admire and respect that. But by all means, if there's an issue with a balky executor or someone trying to scam an estate, call in the regulatory body because they really can make certain things happen that you can't do on your own. And a reminder, again, avoid life income gifts and trusts unless you are certain you have systems and finances in place to do those easily and seamlessly. And even at the Met, we do not. And we're a $4 billion organization, $300 million annual budget, and they just don't want to be anywhere near these. So we do outside vendors to handle our gift annuity program, and we do not serve as trustee, as I said. We can recommend trustees, corporate trustees, but don't go there unless you're sure you have the capability to do so. How do you use the realized plan giving dollars? This is a fairly important thing to consider. Since we generally cannot predict when a supporter will die or when her estate will distribute, again, it can take years for distributions to happen, it makes little sense to have an annual budget goal for realized bequest dollars. Though I did have one at the library when I started. The first 2.5 million of unrestricted went right into the corporate budget. Never had a problem meeting that, but we did change that over time to good effect. Now, at the library, the policy is that all unrestricted bequests are characterized as funds functioning as endowment, or FFE. The Board of Trustees can then recharacterize those funds for operating or other use at any time, but to my knowledge has not. And the Met has a more complicated policy, and only gifts over 100,000, these are unrestricted gifts, mind you, become funds functioning as endowment. That's often also called board designated endowment. And of course, the museum is happy to receive donor designated endowment, but that is true endowment that cannot be changed. These are unrestricted gifts that become endowment, really a rainy day fund, if you will. And more than $100 million in FFE was raised in the first 8 years the library policy was in place. And assuming the endowment draw was roughly 5%, they provided more than $5 million, or have rather provided more than $5 million for annual operations, which is great. And that's really how these things should work. And I think the donors would be pleased if they realized this was the policy. Most gifts at the Met, by contrast, are restricted and also are much, much higher. We get a lot of large gifts for curatorial areas, but every year I get about 15 to 20 million unrestricted, a vast majority of which become board designated endowment. The last year has been an exception, and my $15 million of unrestricted gifts went right into the corporate till to help offset the effect of our COVID shortfall. And that is going to change hopefully next year, but we'll see. We need foreign tourists to come here. So everyone on the call, come to New York and come to the museum. Other back-end considerations, donor imposed restrictions are something you'll have to grapple with. And I assume some of you have. We are happy to honor them as long as they are reasonably consistent with our mission or operations. But hopefully this is something you can discuss with the donor or their advisors while they are still alive. Otherwise, a cypre proceeding is possible, but you generally will not want to go to court to try and get a restriction changed or ameliorated, because it's not easy, it costs a lot, and does not always work. Recognition, none other than listing in the annual report is necessary in my opinion, unless the gift instrument requires naming a plaque or something else. In those latter cases, the trend in the US is to limit the duration of such recognition. So for instance, even if you name a building now in the US, generally that will be only for 50 years. And at that time, the building effectively will become, the naming rights will become available again, and another donor or the same family can do so, but they will only do it for 50 years. I think that's probably not an unreasonable policy, and so far we have very little pushback. But in the past, people could get things permanently named for relatively modest gifts, and that is a trend that is we're trying to stop. And surviving family, gotta love them. I think they're best handled ad hoc, but be sensitive, especially to surviving spouses. I mean, truly, that should be common sense, but Sometimes people get greedy. Charities get a little greedy and don't massage the spouse well enough or appropriately. But do stand up to unhappy, namely disinherited heirs, if their loved one's intentions are clear. In most jurisdictions I know in the US, children have absolutely no right to inherit from their parents. Spouses, of course, can elect against their deceased partner's estate, but children have no legal right. And you should remind them of that if the will benefits you and not them. And every year we get a couple people fishing. My father gave you everything. I think we should have a settlement, and we just stand pat unless there's some clear reason not to. But again, they have no right to their parents' estate, at least under American law. Some final thoughts. Plan giving works best if, one, your donor database is reasonably large and well managed, and two, plan giving is an adequately funded part of development efforts, ideally with dedicated staff, at least part, if not full time. And I think John's comments earlier were right on point. This is an area that may very well be worth developing. It may take some time, but the investment over time should pay off nicely, especially if you get in ahead of the game a little bit and do some good prospecting. Board and senior management must buy in, or you will set yourself up to struggle and fail. This is a long-term investment. There, I say that again. With long-term and sometimes unreliable return. You generally cannot predict when people will die or when their estate will distribute. You can do an ROI analysis on individual marketing efforts, and I suggest you should, but a successful program requires a sustained institutional investment. Don't just put in one newsletter article or one email and assume that you have a program. You need to do it on a regular basis. Consistent messaging is the most important thing, followed by consistent stewardship. Focus on bequest and beneficiary designations and secure these from your board and other influencers who may in turn provide testimonials, and keep the pipeline full. That is my big goal here at the museum and was at the library, to have at least 1,000 pending expectancies, because then I could literally rely on $15 to $20 million of unrestricted bequests pretty consistently with 1,000 people out there. And I should add, I should have said this before, the known expectancies are a minority of what actually comes in. We get the windfalls, I hate to call them that, but they are, from people who are not even in our database. Sometimes they're large gifts. You probably can't see, but behind my right shoulder, there's a little paint by number constable. That came from a lady in New Zealand. We got her entire estate. No known contact before she died, and not even sure she came to New York. But $3 million later, we did pretty well. But you gotta keep the communications going and keep the Legacy Society full, and then there'll be a consistent revenue stream. Think, this will be the third time I say it, don't offer life income gifts or serve as a trustee unless you are competent or can partner with someone who is. Just not something you need to do. Even sophisticated places like where I've been working don't do these. Well, we do life income gifts, but our program is big enough and we have an outside administrator that it works. But if you have a small program like 5 annuities, you're setting yourself up for trouble. Timely and consistent communications, interactions with prospects, advisors, committed donors, estate reps, regulators, vendors, and peers is critical. And I really spend a lot of time with peers on a local plan giving community board. Talk to peers every single day because they very often share estates with us, and they are incredibly helpful when there are issues with problem estates or larger issues in the plan giving sphere. And just by virtue of being on this call and involved with the Charities Institute Ireland, I think you're doing that already, but do develop those peer-to-peer connections because they will be critical in this area. And to the extent that you can leverage off of peers' experience as part of your work, if you're not a dedicated plan giving person, by all means do so. I've found that the peers are incredibly helpful, even if they're not getting anything from an estate with advice and ideas. So the third bullet is kind of the summary. Simply, plan giving is all about creating, and maintaining relationships with your core supporters and eventually with their estates. Be professional but personal, and never forget your organization's mission and your role. I say professional but personal because there is a tendency to become these people's friend. And at some point, you've got to remember which hat you're wearing, and you can wear a friend hat, and that may be appropriate, but always consider your role as a fundraiser for your charity, and always bring it back to the mission. Always bring it back to the mission when you can. Even when someone's venting at you about something totally unrelated, if there's any way you can fold it back into the mission, you've done your job, and they'll appreciate it. So I thank you for your attention and happy to answer questions posed to the chat or the Q&A, or you can email me. And I think I had that at the beginning, but thank you.
Okay. I think it's back to me to facilitate the Q&A. I think that's right. Thanks for that, John. That was great. Just a few questions. I think we're okay. I know it's almost 3:30 here, but I think we'll assume we're okay for the next 10 minutes or so, just to field a few questions and answers. John, just a couple of things really, just to kind of kick it off. One of the things that I just wanted to ask you, obviously a lot of the organizations here would be, are obviously Irish, and they would be looking to North America in terms of the diaspora and fundraising for legacies from Irish Americans and whatnot. Would you have any thoughts or advice in regards to that work? Would that be something that would have been part of your work where you might have come across either in the library or in the Met?
Yeah, not directly, although I do have several peers who are work at American Friends groups of mainly higher educational institutions. And I believe there are a handful of those for Irish groups, maybe even Trinity College, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it's quite popular.
The big ones are the UK, and they have kind of a head start on this, as you mentioned in your remarks, but they're much more active, and every kind of peer charity in the UK has an American Friends group. I'm not really sure I'm answering your question correctly, but if they are wanting US tax advantage, then either a friends group or working with someone like KBF might make sense.
Might make sense.
But,
okay.
Yeah.
Good. You also referred there in your chat, just in terms of one of the key points in my own few words about setting the context was, the lack of legacy promotion and marketing that we're seeing here. And you just referred to one of your thoughts, the ROI on the marketing efforts. Could you just say a few, because it's impossible to do ROI on the investment and the return, but definitely it's possible to do it on the marketing ROI. Just chat to that for a couple of minutes, just give us a sense of what you would normally be doing in your work.
It's pretty crude, but this is satisfied both my bosses downtown and up here at the museum. I know the cost of the mailing. I don't even factor in the cost of my time and my helper's time, but just the brute cost, out-of-pocket cost of the mailing. And then I say we got X number of qualified leads and Y number of actual new commitments. And I have a rolling average of the size of an average realized commitment. I multiply that time less than $1 million, so it's a very conservative number. I multiply that times the number of new commitments that resulted from the mailing, and say that this cost us $15,000, but we have $2.2 million in future commitments as a result of this mailing. And that it's very crude, but that seems to satisfy their desire to fund me, my salary, our two-person team, and allow us to do out-of-pocket cost mailing. Wow. It sounds kind of silly, but it's actually true. The big deal there is how long someone lives beyond the time that they tell us we're in the plan, and whether they remove us from their plan. But that's another point. Very few people, once they have announced a commitment, will change their mind. Some lose their money or spend it all while they're alive, but that's pretty uncommon. And more commonly, we see people give us more than they thought they would. But these are generally very prudent people, especially the single ladies, like retired school teachers, librarians, civil servants, are fantastic. They don't spend a dime on themselves, and then the charities they love regularly get 6-7 figure requests.
That's brilliant. It's One of the other things that I meant to say by way of my introduction was the cultural sector and your experience in the cultural sector in America. One of the things that Niall in Campaign Solutions, his recent research identified was that the cultural sector in Ireland have little or no legacy income. And I was just wondering, I just wanted to ask you, just in terms of the cultural sector in North America, how are you vis-a-vis other sectors? Is the cultural sector particularly successful at raising planned giving and legacies vis-a-vis other sectors, or are you, in fact, the poor brother or sister, so to speak?
In general, we're the poor brother and sister.
Okay.
Education, private universities in particular, cause-related charities, the big ones. Religious, of course, is by far the biggest here too.
Yeah.
I happen to work at two of the outliers, and I guess the library is more educational than not. But the Met has, again, made the sustained investment, so we're doing extremely well in this area. But many smaller culturals don't do this at all, much to their detriment, especially performing arts, with a few exceptions.
Yeah.
But a lot of our sister museums have either small programs or no program at all, and they're not getting those six-figure bequests that add up to several $1 million a year, because they're not telling people, put us in your plans.
Put it in your plans. Okay, great. Just in terms of other questions coming in, there's one here just referring to how do you get past your old and debt topics, as this can be very negative. Now, I suppose you must have experience of that just in relation to talking about the topic with donors. And you could add into that just as well, what are the unique insights in relation to the impact of COVID, for example, on your work program? Because obviously people here on the talk would be familiar with how COVID's impacting on them. Just be curious to see if it's any different in where you.
As I said, there's a lot of death and taxes, and we try and avoid those and not like things to talk about. But we try and be very straightforward. We never use euphemisms for death. We always say dead, die, active verbs. We don't use passing and kind of other things like that. So we don't try and sugarcoat things. We also, again, don't really emphasize that. And it comes up more commonly in working with peers in the institution. They assume that anyone who's 80 years old should talk to me and not to them, that kind of a thing, which is fine, but that's also a little short-sighted, if you will. And I think we always try and be extremely straightforward, both with the donors and especially with their advisors. We don't sugarcoat anything. And if they ask a question, we'll answer it, even if it basically is presuming that their client's dead, which is generally when we're going to get the money. Never had a problem with a donor. Occasionally they get morbid on me. And then you just try and steer it back to something positive and hopefully something about your organization and the mission. And I think they understand that the museum will be here long after they're gone, and they want to be part of that. That's why they're doing this. And that's pretty appealing. And that kind of sells itself. And it does help to work at a place that is bricks and mortar, because I can see people on site. But some of the bigger programs in the US are cause-related charities with no physical presence, but really strong missions, Doctors Without Borders and so on.
Yeah, also here. Okay, I think that's it. We're done. I think next up, just to say by way of, I think it was terrific, John. There's loads of practical stuff in there, loads of ideas for everyone. I said in my opening remarks, like, the great thing is about seeing how other people, particularly outside, are doing things and what we can learn. So I've no doubt that people, when they get the presentation tomorrow, will see at least half a dozen things that will inspire them or provide them with some guidance and help. So it was very practical, so that was great. Thank you very much. And I think just maybe then I'm handing back to Elena.
Yes. Oh, there I am. Okay, wonderful. Yes, let me just type in real quick, and then I'll turn it over to Mark to say thank you so much, John Bacon. Thank you so much for joining us. I know your insights are always so welcome for audiences in Europe, so truly thank you. Thank you, John Sutton, for sharing your thoughts and setting the context. And thank you so much to Mark for being a wonderful partner, Charities Institute Ireland. We hope to bring you more events in the future. And I'll turn it over to you to just say the final word and goodbye. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And look, much of what you said, Elena, I want to thank everyone who joined us today. I've absolutely no doubt that you were able to take some learnings away. Charities Institute Ireland host a legacy forum for our members, and that happens 3 times a year. So do feel free to get in touch with me at any time for more information on that. John Sutton, thanks for providing the Irish context to legacy giving in Ireland. John Bacon, thanks to you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge in the area of planned giving. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I've absolutely no doubt that your words are going to prompt many of the attendees to start the conversation about legacy giving to those on their database. And I hope that in the years ahead, Irish charities will invest in legacy giving more and have dedicated fundraisers focused on growing legacy gifts. Elena, thanks to you. Thanks to everyone at KBFUS for partnering with CII. Once again, it's an absolute pleasure working with you and your team. That's everything for me for the moment, and thanks for everyone for staying on and for attending today.
Yeah. Are we still on?